just thrilled to be able to share some of my thoughts, but I'm actually much more interested in hearing what all of you are thinking right now. You know, as someone who spends a lot of time writing about this and thinking about this, I certainly have a historical perspective on this subject of monuments, memorials, about what it tells us about how Americans have struggled to come to terms with the Civil War and its legacy. That's a complex story in and of itself. But I don't think anything could have prepared me for what's happened over the last 3 weeks. I still have to do a double take looking at some of the photographs of Monument Avenue, which I know some of you who are joining us tonight saw in person last year. I still have to do a double take. I still am trying to wrap my head around the pace at which we are reviewing monuments and taking them down. We may see 1 or 2 come down tonight. So every morning I wake up and I'm recording, trying to keep track, trying to keep a list, and it's becoming very difficult to do so. That's how fast we're seeing things transpire. And so like I said, I'm trying to wrap my head around this, trying to make sense of it, trying to figure out, even though it may be too early to do so, where this last 3 weeks fits into the broader story of the history of Civil War, mainly Confederate monuments. And so I'm only going to spend about 10 minutes showing you some slides, just trying to give you a little bit of a foundation, so a point of reference. Some of you will be familiar with some of these images, and then we can open it up. And that's really what I want to get to, have a discussion. Let's talk through some of these issues and see if we can make some sense of it. So I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see here, share. Let's see if I can do this. So hopefully all of you are seeing PowerPoint. This is good? Okay, perfect. I just want to start real fast with this slide because, of course, I think this map tells us quite a bit about why long-term, historically, these monuments have been so controversial. The dots represent either monuments or memorials dedicated mainly roughly between 1880 and 1930. I mean, even sort of before and after, there are Confederate monuments that are dedicated, but the vast majority that are now under question, under review, being torn down, were dedicated during this specific period between 1880 and 1930. And what I want you to sort of see, and this is really important as we go forward, is that we're talking about, I know this is review for many of you, maybe not so much the adults who are listening, but this is the period of Jim Crow, right? This is the period of legalized segregation throughout much of the former Confederacy, the American South. And what I want you to sort of understand here is that we're talking about disfranchisement by constitutional amendment. We're talking about legalized segregation reinforced by lynching during this period, roughly 4,000 African Americans lynched during this period. But I also want you to sort of notice the brown area, right? These are the counties in these southern states that during this period were over 50% African American. So why does that matter? Well, a lot of people are trying to make the argument as a justification for removing or relocating these monuments that they do not represent the values of the community today in 2020, right? And in many cases, that is certainly true. If you look at the makeup, the balance between white residents and people of color, African Americans. But what I want you to notice on this map is that in many parts of the former Confederacy, when these monuments and memorials were dedicated, they never represented the community. Even the majority, those brown areas are areas that were more than 50% African American. And so a couple things to sort of take away from this is that monuments, memorials are political weight. They are political power. They represent the people who had the power and the resources to put them up originally. And many of these memorials, if not all of them, celebrate the Confederacy. They celebrate an attempt to create an independent slaveholding republic based on white supremacy. And they're celebrating that decades after the end of the Civil War, decades after the period of Reconstruction, when African Americans, for the first time in American history, are voting in large numbers, are serving in state assemblies, even in the Congress, in few numbers in Washington, D.C. And so these conversations that we're having today are a kind of reckoning with this past, right? They are, for the first time, perhaps the most sort of fruitful or just the most vibrant discussions that we've had about these monuments, in many cases since they first were dedicated. Now, I want to move to Richmond because I know that that's sort of the case study we'll look at tonight. And obviously we're talking roughly in this area of Virginia. That, of course, in 1890, when the Lee Monument went up, that was predominantly an African-American area, the surrounding counties outside of Richmond. When this monument was dedicated in 1890, there were no houses. It was tobacco fields fairly recently, cleared out to make room for a new residential neighborhood, a brand new neighborhood. These monuments were part of the very structure of the neighborhood, what's called the West End of Richmond. But 150,000 people took part in this dedication of the Lee statue in May of 1890. And this neighborhood specifically, if you read the newspaper articles in Richmond by real estate companies, the real estate ads that were published make very clear that these homes that you're seeing, these beautiful homes that surround Monument Avenue, would only be sold to white families. African Americans were not allowed to move into the West End of Richmond. So these monuments, in many cases, these Confederate monuments were added to key public landscapes during this Jim Crow era. Courthouses, public parks, prominent intersections. The monuments on Monument Avenue were actually part of the very structure or map, neighborhood map of this neighborhood from day one. So they helped to frame an all-white neighborhood, okay? And so these monuments come to reinforce where people live. What neighborhoods are white? What neighborhoods are non-white? If you have a monument on a courthouse square, think about that message that it sends the white people of a community as opposed to African Americans. Who's considered a full citizen? Whose history is represented as part of the official story of that respective community? So these monuments have a great deal of power to this day. And I think that's one of the reasons why they are such lightning rods. Of course, let's not lose sight of the fact that the immediate cause of this most recent wave of removals has to do with a police shooting in Minnesota, the killing of George Floyd. And what's quite remarkable about what's happened in Richmond, and this is what I'm trying to sort of wrap my head around, is the way in which these sites on Monument Avenue, especially the Robert E. Lee statue, has been transformed in the last 3 weeks. I apologize for some of the language. I actually didn't notice it until sort of close to the to this meeting, so I apologize for that. But look around, look at the way in which this monument has now been appropriated by mainly Black Richmonders. I argue in a recent editorial that I published that it's likely that more Black Richmonders have visited this site in the last 3 weeks than the entire 130 years of the life of this monument. I think that says something interesting about people wanting to claim a place that was never considered open to them or welcoming as now their own. And if you actually, I haven't been there, I'm dying to go down there, but for the pandemic, I would be there right now. But a lot of the graffiti or tagging is political. You can see they turned the base of it into a makeshift memorial. You can see little cards that on them are African Americans who have been recently shot by police officers. African American graduates are holding ceremonies on this site, speeches throughout the afternoon, evening. And what I find so interesting at night, this is actually a close-up of the graffiti. I just want to sort of give you a sense of, and you can see actually the memorial at the bottom. You can also see the tents surrounding it. People are actually sleeping there, or they were. The police have begun to crack down a bit more. There's graffiti on the other monuments as well, but this has become the rallying point, okay? Now I should update you and just so all of us are on the same page. This is on state property. The governor has committed the state to removing it. There is a pending lawsuit. The other Confederate monuments are city-owned, and a new law goes into effect on July 1st. The city has pledged to remove those Confederate monuments. But you can see the memorial at the bottom. You can see just how they leave paint cans around the base so people can add their messages, and they are quite political. But it's at night that this thing really comes alive. And there's a local artist who has been projecting images of African Americans. The first one was George Floyd himself. And then after that, it was Harriet Tubman, Martin Luther King, and the one I think is the most powerful is Frederick Douglass. The Black Lives Matter is projected onto Lee himself. You have the Frederick Douglass quote. This is a beautiful example in my mind of the way in which these sites are being contextualized by locals. This is history from the bottom up, history from the grassroots, taking control and trying to reshape how we think about these public, very powerful Confederate monuments. This is the only one that this is happening with. The other ones are damaged. Here's Jeb Stuart. Some of you may remember seeing Jeb Stuart. He's got a new hat. It looks like you can still see the plume from his cavalryman's hat, but it's been you can see the cone has been added, and so you can see the ways in which these monuments are now being, in a way, taken over, appropriated. Up and down Monument Avenue. I don't have an image of it, but in December, a new statue was dedicated just off of Monument Avenue at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. Black artist by the name of Kendi Wiley. You can look him up. They dedicated a new statue called Rumors of War. And it is an equestrian statue. The horse, if you look at this statue, is modeled on the Stuart horse. But instead of a Confederate general, it is a young African-American man. And that is located just a few blocks from this, right next door to the headquarters of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which was actually torched on the first night on which this tagging, or if you want to call it vandalism, began to take place. So we don't know how much damage was done, but even the headquarters of the United Daughters of the Confederacy was vandalized. Just to give you a couple other examples of statues that are in the news, have been removed. This one just yesterday in South Carolina. This is John Calhoun, one-time vice president, senator from South Carolina. Calhoun was largely responsible. I don't want to give him the sole responsibility, but by the 1830s, as white Southerners are trying to offer the best spin on slavery, justifying it, Calhoun really did provide the ideological underpinnings of slavery, of the pro-slavery argument that white Southerners rallied around in the last few decades leading up to the Civil War. This statue was dedicated in 1896. This is the second one. Both from the beginning were vandalized by local African Americans. So this one has always been controversial. The white church in the background, that is Mother Emanuel. That is the church back in June of 2015 that Dylann Roof walked in, sat down in a Bible study for an hour, and then got up and murdered 9 Black churchgoers. That is the moment, that was the catalyst for this most recent wave of removals after Dylann Roof. Photographs of him were published showing him waving Confederate battle flags. So that started the most recent wave of removals of Confederate flags, and especially the monuments. This one, just last couple days, has been in the news. This is in front of the Museum of Natural History in New York City. That's Teddy Roosevelt. It was dedicated in 1939. It is depicting sort of the hierarchy of civilizations, the triumph of white civilization, the United States, if you will, as an imperialist power. I don't think I really need to explain much in terms of what people now see as problematic. The hierarchy of the races of civilizations that seems to be depicted here. The museum has decided that it will move it into the museum and to contextualize it, which I think is the right move to make. Somebody actually did throw a bucket of paint, of red paint, on the base of it this morning. So people aren't waiting for museums to do the right thing in their mind. But I think this won't be around for that much longer. And then the last one I'll leave you with, I think many of you remember this. This is, I was leading a tour. I lead teacher tours every summer of monuments in and around DC. And of course, this is one of the memorials that we stop at. This is the Freedmen's Memorial. There's a copy of it in my hometown right now of Boston. The Boston Arts Commission just held a meeting tonight to figure out what to do with it. This is the original, dedicated in 1876. I can go into the history a little bit later if you want to talk about this one. But obviously, again, the relative position of Lincoln hovering over the kneeling slave, a very popular motif among abolitionists before the Civil War, was even controversial when Frederick Douglass delivered the dedication address in 1876. He was troubled by the kneeling slave. And I think looking at it from our perspective in 2020, we can also, I think, see some issues that need to be addressed. What to do with all of these monuments, you know, that's complicated. There is no sort of one-shop solution. These decisions need to be made in local communities, in my view, depending on who's involved, what resources are available. But I will say this, and we can open this up. You know, I want to just sort of speak to the students listening right now. You know, the people who are typically interviewed about these subjects are people with varying degrees of gray hair, right? And we all have a stake in this. And I do not want to minimize that in any way. I care deeply about this subject. And I know many of the other adults do as well who are with us tonight. But for me, as a teacher and as a historian of this subject, this is really for you guys to decide. Much of the action that we are seeing over the last 3 weeks is being led by young people. They're the ones who are taking the lead over the conversation about these monuments. And it upsets a lot of people. But I think one thing we can't lose sight of is the fact that this question about monuments is a question essentially about who we take ourselves to be. Monuments at their best reflect our collective values, reflect who we think we are as members of our individual communities, our local communities, our states, and our countries. And so the question about whether these monuments should stay, be relocated, whatever, is about ultimately what kind of communities you guys want to live in moving forward. What do you want to see around you? Will it make you feel proud? Will it make you feel ashamed? Will it make you feel as if you are a full citizen? Will it make you feel as if you are something else, alienated from that community? And so these are questions about democracy itself. These are questions about how we organize ourselves in our local communities and how we see ourselves and one another. And so with that, I don't know, Jonathan, if I should keep the screen up, or do we want to go back to a full view where I can see everyone? Either way, maybe.
Yeah, well, I would say we'll go back to full view, but before we do, if you could go back to your first slide, there was a question, the map there of the Confederate memorials, and it dates the years that, well, so, actually, yeah, it has some years on that, but could you speak to when the Confederate memorials themselves went up and kind of the time frame we're looking at?
Yeah. So again, the dots. This was a map that a friend of mine just added the memorials to, and again, we're talking basically about that period between 1880 and 1930 when this map fills in with these dots, right, with these circles, if you will. The dates are the dates in which these, and this is actually a real, I'm glad that question was asked. So go to Virginia 1901, 1902. That's the year that Virginia rewrites its state constitution. Now, why are these dates important? Because those state constitutions, when they rewrite them, in many cases, take Mississippi, 1890. This is the first time that the states have rewritten their constitutions after Reconstruction. So after the military occupation, after these states are out from under the control of the federal government, they take it up themselves to write so they can disfranchise as many people that voted during Reconstruction as possible. And that means mainly African Americans. So they do this a couple ways. They institute poll taxes. So if you want to vote, not a problem. 15th Amendment, of course, has been ratified, but you have to pay a tax. In Virginia, there's a grandfather clause. You can vote in Virginia as long as your grandfather voted in the 1860 election. Now, what does that mean? It means that the vast majority of African Americans, their grandfather was enslaved in 1860. So because their grandfather didn't vote, they can't vote. And then, of course, the other sort of way in which they limit the franchise or the vote is the literacy tests. You can vote in these states as long as you can read a copy of the Constitution, as long as you can not only read it, but interpret what it means. And I love to use that example because, you know, in my AP classes even, I'll hand out a copy of the Constitution. And I mean, you know, you look at this text and there are so many questions about what different sections mean, right? And so, of course, even if you can read it, whether you can properly interpret it is another thing entirely. So these states during this time are rewriting their constitution to legalize segregation and white supremacy. And that's why all of this together is really important to sort of come to terms with. So I hope that answers the question. It's a really good one.
And let's open this up. And I'd really, I mean, it's a lot to think about, and a lot to think about in terms of where we are. I wonder, are there any students who any of our students who either participated on the trip or perhaps when you were writing a research paper about a memorial, in terms of your thoughts and reflections on what you're seeing now?
There's also a question about Grant and the statue in San Francisco.
Do you want to take that?
Yeah, real fast. You know, I think it's not surprising that we are seeing, I don't want to necessarily call it collateral damage because it could have been intentional. I think a lot of the people in my community are wondering, well, why did they take down Grant? He defeated the Confederacy. But I think, of course, we do need to look at this carefully. I do think that quite often we lose sight of the fact that many of, at least on the Union side, but on both sides, many of the high-ranking military officers do go on to careers out west. And of course, the way in which America, I think we have to understand the Civil War as part of a larger imperialist move west that displaces, of course, Native Americans. The military, of course, was in the vanguard of that, right? They did the work of displacing Native Americans. So whether or not that larger 19th century push west, you know, has something to do with it, could be. But it's difficult to know. In Wisconsin last night, they pulled down a statue in front of the State House to a Norwegian immigrant who was a diehard abolitionist and fought in the Union Army and was killed in the middle of the war. So, you know, are people just pulling things down for the sake of pulling them down? I suspect so in some cases, yeah.
Ruslana, you want to, you've got your hand raised, introduce yourself.
Hi, my name's Ruslana. I'm a rising senior. And okay, I have a rather unusual question.
Awesome.
And I'll preface this with some context. My mother is very fond of bringing very controversial topics to the dinner table, right? And so she was talking about how Christopher Columbus's statue was, I don't know if it was removed, or at least there was talk of removing it. And my mom is Chinese, and she grew up in China during the Communist Revolution. So her education didn't really involve like too much of like Columbus's subjugation of native peoples. Naturally, she doesn't know that much about that, but she made a comparison that I found that kind of like struck me silent for a couple seconds because I'd never thought of it. Where she said she and her friends are against like the statues taken down. My reaction was like, how could you be against that? Like these Confederate soldiers and Christopher Columbus, he discovered the new world in some senses, but also, and then she said, it reminds us of the Cultural Revolution. And I was like, whoa, I never thought of that. Where like, you have a lot of radical and like a younger population being very like tearing down historical symbols and that kind of thing. And I was just wondering, what's your opinion of that topic or that kind of thing, that kind of connection?
Yeah, that's fascinating. First, I would say that this is a great example of the way in which history and memory often overlap. And what I mean by that is, you know, there's the history of the subject that the monument or statue represents, and we can debate about what that means. There is the way in which people attach meaning to these statues, their life stories that they bring to these spaces where these monuments and memorials are located. And then I would add a third element here, which is then there is the personal background of the people themselves, of the individuals themselves, that we are not, we bring our own life stories with us when we're thinking about the past and our relationship to the past and representations of the past. And I guess what I'm saying here, if I hope I don't want to sound too convoluted, is it sounds like, your mother is a classic example of your mother bringing her own personal background and fears and concerns to these sites. And I who am I to disagree with that? That is a fact, right? That speaks to the complexity of, or the interaction between the public and these memorials. The only thing I would say about this is that the Cultural Revolution, as I understand it, is largely the government censoring, is the government deciding what representations of the past will reinforce political control, ideological control, right? And so it would be interesting if you could continue this conversation and perhaps find a way to sort of bring the element of, well, what happens when it's the people that are doing the work here of trying to reevaluate our public landscapes and sending the message to the government instead of the government trying to send the message back? Like right now, what's happening? I mean, certainly the president of the United States, and I don't want to get overly political tonight with all of you, but certainly the president of the United States is staking a position on these monuments. And I would argue he's taking a position on Confederate monuments, even if he has not been explicit about it. But he only has so much power in all of this. In fact, he has very little power because these monuments, memorials are for the most part on state ground, local ground, right? Public ground. And I think getting back to the point that what we're seeing is the public rising up and expressing its concern and demanding change. So I hope you continue this discussion with your mother, because that's the kind of, that is the perfect kind of discussion to have. That gets at just how complex these issues are. Great question.
Daniel Wolf.
Hi, yeah, I'm Daniel. I'm also a rising senior, and I went on the battle kite trip last year.
Yeah.
And we went to Monticello, and we talked a lot about Jefferson and how, there's a lot of great things about him, but he also owned slaves, and he had a lot of moral quandaries regarding like slavery.
Yeah.
And now I'm seeing on social media, but I've also read some articles that some people are starting to call for the removal of statues or memorials dedicated to Jefferson or Washington. And I'm wondering what you think about that. Like, where's the line? Is owning slaves enough to counteract all the good things that Jefferson did for America, and is memorializing him unjust because he owned slaves? I'm wondering what you think about.
Where are you on this right now? Can I put you on the spot for a minute?
Yeah, I'm torn. But when I think of what we learned in history class and what I read about history, like Jefferson played such a huge role in the development of the country. And I'd say my current position is leaning towards Jefferson statues or Washington memorials remaining, but I'm wondering your input on it, being that you're much more educated on the topic.
Well, I lived in Charlottesville for 11 years and taught there, so I know Monticello really well. I'm glad you guys went there. Yeah, look, I think one thing to keep in mind about all of these statues and monuments, and again, it's a point I made at the beginning, is that this is nothing new, right? The calling for the removal of a Jefferson statue, or even vandalizing statues, like that is, we have a long history of that. The American Revolution started off by New Yorkers pulling down, a statue of King George in New York City, right after the Declaration of Independence was read. In fact, it was melted down, it was turned into bullets. So they shot British soldiers with a monument, right, to King George. So there's a long history of this, including Jefferson. I do think there is a distinction to be made between the founding fathers, who certainly were invested in the institution of slavery. Jefferson is the classic example, right? And we want to make the room for the fact that he questioned it, right? He certainly didn't do much about it. He was in debt for most of his life. He didn't, his enslaved men and women, children were sold off to pay his debts when he died in 1826. And I know one statue of Jefferson was toppled, but I think there is a difference between Jefferson and Confederates who they were trying to create a nation committed to protecting slavery and white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a distinction there between individuals who owned enslaved people, but also helped to create a nation that had the tools, namely in a constitution that was flawed, no doubt about that, but included the tools to eventually begin the elimination of slavery. So while I think there is a distinction, I don't have an issue with people calling for the removal of monuments. I don't necessarily think that monuments, by definition, are timeless. There should be an escape clause somewhere. When you get married, you commit to life, right, till death do you part. But there's a way out, right? There's a way to evaluate, right? And so I have no problem with sort of questioning our public memorial landscapes, our monument landscapes, if it means that the questions we're going to engage in are about, again, those overarching values that we think we embody. And I also want to make the point, I think your question is a good one to bring this up, and that is, we're not talking about erasing history. We're not talking about, by removing a statue of Thomas Jefferson, that we're no longer going to study Thomas Jefferson. In fact, the removal of a monument might actually signal that we are intensely interested in the history of that respective subject. why else are we focused on it right now, right? So the history will continue. We'll continue to dig into these subjects. The question again is whether or not the monuments themselves are doing the work that we want monuments to do. And I suspect, look, in the end, you know, if a statue of Jefferson or two comes down, you're still going to have the Jefferson Memorial in DC. That's not going anywhere. And other key memorials that, you know, honor Jefferson, or not only honor Jefferson, but also I think Monticello in a way is a kind of memorial to Jefferson. But I don't think anyone here tonight would advocate tearing it down, because I think most of you, if not all of you, would sort of acknowledge that there is something educational about that site. There is something to be learned about any number of things that you only get from going to a place like Monticello. That's a good question. And again, it's one of those questions that I'm still trying to come to terms with.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, good luck.
Thank you, Daniel. We've got two related comments, so let me call on Dave Alberga first. Dave, you there?
I'm here. Yeah, thank you. Jonathan, thanks for making this happen, and Kevin, thanks for presenting this. There's a couple of, obviously, look, there's a lot of nested issues here. One of the really interesting acid tests is to look at what the original purpose was of the dedication and the installation of the monument in the first place. Yeah. And if you go to that, it's actually fairly instructive, right? So if it was put in place to essentially remind African Americans of their place in society, that tells you something. Right after Reconstruction. If it was put in place in the case of this Jefferson Memorial, that wasn't the intent of the Jefferson Memorial. And so that helps, and look, I'm not suggesting that Jefferson, it wasn't a very complex, and there's a very, there are lots of reasons to not be a fan of Jefferson. But I really think if you go to the intent of the dedication and building of the monument, it's fairly instructive in telling you about whether it really should, whether it's fair to belong there or not. So, first comment. Second is, and I'll just bring this up and then I'll leave. It's interesting, I went to West Point, and there are a lot of West Pointers being pulled down off of pedestals in the last week, which most of them probably deserve. There is, at West Point itself, a very big debate going on now. There's a barracks that cadets live in named after Lee. There is a painting of Lee, two paintings of Lee on campus, and one other small, kind of more administrative dedication to Lee, because he was the superintendent of West Point before the war. And there is a raging debate right now amongst West Point graduates as to what West Point should do about its Lee problem. But the very fact that the discussion is going on and it's being labeled the Lee problem, to me is progress. So.
Yeah, so there are a couple things. Yeah, there was a very serious Lee problem at West Point. And it speaks to the larger issue with the military right now with military bases, right? So there has been a call to rename military bases named after Confederate generals, to rename them after other people who are more deserving, as they say. And this is an example where the top brass right now, as I understand it, is all for opening this discussion, but of course there's pushback by the commander-in-chief himself. So we'll see how that plays out. The original purpose point is a really good one, and I think it really does sort of get at something crucial here, which is crucial about monuments generally, and that is that when you're looking at a monument, you are not looking at, monuments are not windows into the events or the history that they supposedly commemorate. A monument to Robert E. Lee is not a history lesson about Robert E. Lee, right? That's an important distinction. What you're looking at is a reflection of what people at the time, whether it's 1890 in Richmond or any other point, what the people at the time chose to put up as a reflection of their community, their collective past. And the dedication speeches in many of these, or for many of these monuments, really do help us better understand how people at the time chose to, mark the moment, through this monument or statue. So the history that we're really learning in a monument is not the history of Jefferson, for example. It's the history of the organizers and the individuals who said, you know what, we really got to have a statue of Jefferson on this spot, right? That's what we're learning about first and foremost. I'm a little weary of sort of going into the West Point issue because, as I said before, my own view is that these communities really have to figure these issues out for themselves, and West Point is digging in, right? They've actually done a really good job, and I've talked to people who are sort of on the ground, sort of helping to lead these discussions. What I will say is, as a citizen, I'm just sort of speaking as a citizen, there is something very troubling about honoring an individual who chose to resign his commission in the US military and fight to destroy the United States. I'm not saying that as a historian. I'm saying that as a citizen of the United States of America, right? I have a problem with that. And let me back up just a slight bit here, because there's a memory aspect to this story. Robert E. Lee emerged by the early 20th century as a national icon, not just in the South, throughout the United States. Eisenhower, he was one of Dwight Eisenhower's top 6 most important Americans, right? Now, if you take Lee, the problem is we want to remember Lee for the tough choice he had in 1861 as to whether to remain loyal to the United States or to resign his commission in defense of Virginia and the Confederacy. And that is supposed to command our respect somehow. But here's the problem with that. There were just as many people, there were plenty of people in Virginia and other southern states in 1861, West Point graduates who had the same decision to make. Winfield Scott goes back to the War of 1812, also a former commander of West Point. George Thomas of Virginia. These men, no one has ever heard of, but they were white Southerners, some of them with slave-owning backgrounds, and they chose not to resign their commissions in the US Army. They lost family as a result of it. Lee did as well, right? It split his family, but we don't honor them anywhere. We've completely forgotten about them as a nation. And so I want to sort of push back in a way on the Lee cult by saying, you know what? It might hurt a little bit, right? But especially at West Point, I have a problem with that. And again, I say that as a citizen of the country and not necessarily as a historian. But it's a great point you're making, and lots of
Kevin, for reference, I think he should. I think the administrative stuff is fine. The memorials and the barracks are not, and there are plenty of worthy Medal of Honor winners and commanders to name things after.
Yeah, and here's the other thing I would say, just as a response to that, is that, look, there is no worry, there's no risk that Robert E. Lee will be lost to the institutional memory of West Point, right? Cadets there's still much to learn about Lee as a military figure, at West Point, and even beyond, even his career in the US military before the war. The question, of course, is whether or not he deserves to be honored, right? That's the distinction, right? And I think you're getting at that as well. Thanks.
Ricardo, you're up next.
Yes.
Hey, Ricardo.
So, hi, I'm Ricardo. I'm a rising junior at Country Day. And I was listening to a talk by Stephen Kotkin earlier today, and he was speaking about memorials, but using them in form of reconciliation.
Yeah.
And going back to this idea of purpose, so we use them to reconcile after something like that. and that in that case they might be appropriate to use. And I was thinking like what your view on that was.
Yeah, so I probably have to listen to it, but you know, I've heard that before from other people, that memorials, monuments are places to rally around. And I think that happens in plenty of places, right? The most obvious example is the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., which, I mean, at times has been a place of division, but there are plenty of examples, of course, and you guys studied some of them, where the country comes together, the country comes to sort of push forward. The most obvious example, of course, is King's gathering at the Lincoln Memorial during the Civil Rights era. But there are plenty of Marian Anderson's performance at the Lincoln Memorial. So there are plenty of examples here where people do rally around these sites. The problem or the challenge is, what do you do about those places, those memorials that really don't have much of an opportunity or chance to foster that kind of reconciliation, right? And so, tonight I was listening in on this Boston Arts Commission meeting, talking about that last image, that Lincoln statue with the kneeling slave. And like I said, we have a copy of that in downtown Boston. And the question is what to do about it. And one woman early on during the testimony said that she envisioned it as a place where white, Black Bostonians can gather around, and if they're properly contextualized, in other words, if we take steps to place, say, panels around the base of the memorial that explain its history, that explain why it looks the way it does, that's an opportunity for us to learn from each other, right? So there's a way in which we can build bridges, right? And I think in many ways, like, that sounds right. I mean, as a history teacher, it's like, yeah, I mean, the more history teaching we can do, the better, right? So what's wrong with that? So then a few minutes after that, a young African-American woman got on. And she starts off by saying, I live right next door to this memorial. And she described, and she was in tears at one point, she described what it's like every morning to have to walk by this memorial as a Black woman. And she has a young son, and her son constantly asks him, and I was on the verge of tears when I heard this. She said, what am I supposed to tell my son every time he looks up at that memorial and says, Mommy, why does that Black man who looks like Daddy, why is he on his knees in front of a white man? Right? And, first your heart sinks. And then if you think about those two comments side by side, you ask yourself, can you reconcile those? Right? Like, what do you tell that young mother, right? How do you explain to her that this memorial is a possible site of reconciliation, a possible site of education? And so I do think that some of these spaces do foster that, what you're getting at here. And I think you still have plenty of places where it's just, the road forward is just not clear, at least not in my mind, right? And that's what I mean, and I struggle with that again, not really so much as a historian, but as a community member who believes first and foremost that I have an obligation to do what I can to make sure that everyone feels as if they're welcome in the city that I call home, right? And so these issues really touch at not so much history, right? I mean, I think that's what we're seeing in so many ways in the last 3 weeks, that people are not really looking for a history lesson from people like me. They got the history in a way. Whether or not I think it's sophisticated enough, what they're doing is they're making a statement about their communities, right? And I think that is the front line of this public discussion. And it's necessarily muddy, and it's going to be difficult moving forward. But we have the luxury of being able to do that, right? We live in that kind of country. And again, I've said this already, to me, that's what democracy is all about, right? So it's a great question. I hope I did your question some justice there. It's a good one.
Johnny, I believe you're coming to us over the phone.
Hi, I'm Johnny. I'm going to be a junior next year. I did my paper on the Stone Mountain carving in Georgia.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering how you think that would be taken down, or if ever, because it's so big and so dangerous and expensive to be taken down. And what do you think could be done about it?
So I assume you've never seen it, right?
Just pictures.
Yeah, just pictures. So I only saw it in person for the first time last year. And this is, of course, after years of looking at photographs going all the way back to the original carving that was much larger. It was supposed to include hundreds of soldiers and a long train of Confederate soldiers. It was eventually blasted off for a much more simplistic relief that just features Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson. So this, of course, for the rest of you who may not know much about Stone Mountain, you can Google it, and you will see I mean, it is a work of art. It is also quite horrifying. The original carving or relief was the site of the reconstitution in 1915 of the Ku Klux Klan. So the original Klan, had largely been run out by the federal government, mainly because of efforts by Ulysses S. Grant. He held hearings in Washington, D.C. in the 1870s about the Klan and other white terrorist groups that were, of course, focusing on newly freed slaves. So that site, of course, there you go. The site itself, it's not just the relief that you're looking at that is important here. The grounds in front of you are owned privately. So the state owns the park. But the grounds around it basically are a Confederate memorial in and of itself. On the right and left, you walk up these paths that are paid for by individual Southern states that basically wax poetic about their great Confederate heroes from their respective states. At night, they basically hold a light show on the monument or the side of the mountain itself. To the right of this photograph is a theme park, or a sort of a small, not amusement park, but you walk through it and there's shops, like a little amusement fair. It's horrifying in many respects, but it's massive. You really don't get a sense of just the scale until you're standing right below it on the far side of the pond. This site has been under review for a number of years. In recent years, a number of neo-Confederate groups will regularly march to the top of it, and with their Confederate flags and their music, they'll hold rallies at the top. There was an effort a couple years ago to contextualize it by placing a bell at the top of it that would have had an inscription honoring Martin Luther King. And there was also talk at one point of placing a statue somewhere at the base that honored Black Union soldiers, right? United States colored troops. I don't believe much of that. There's been much progress, in sort of pushing forward in that regard. Yeah, it's a huge problem, and it is one of the most unapologetic sort of pro-Confederate memorials out there anywhere in the United States. And of course, you add to that the fact that it is a very popular site historically, with the Klan, even though they don't really spend much time there, at least not in their robes, they still consider it a sacred site. And so there has been talk, and I suspect that that will continue in the coming weeks and months, and we'll see what happens with it. But I'm just sort of trying to envision what that will look like if they place explosives in it and start blowing it out of the side of the mountain. I mean, what a sight that will be. But it is a highly problematic site, to say the least.
Ashley, you're up, and Ashley is joining us all the way from Korea. So we've pretty much
great.
got halfway across the globe from you.
Wow.
Hi, my name's Ashley Lee. I just want to say thank you for joining the discussion. I'm just really glad to hear your opinions and thoughts on this as like
This is awesome. Thanks.
an educator. Yeah, no problem. So my question was just kind of related to, I think, education around these issues and what you think would be the best move in doing so and approaching this. For example, I think my current, I just think I should add, I was on the Battle Cry of Freedom trip.
Yeah.
So that was kind of like my introduction to this issue of like US history and some of the problematic parts of our history. My question was, in this current climate, I think one of my responsibilities and duties as like a student, as a young citizen of America, and as a daughter is like kind of to try and educate people around me, and those people probably my parents, on the issues of like the Confederate statues and the problematic history within our country, because they only really know what they've been shown in the media, and sometimes that's, I don't know, controversial at times or blown up. They haven't learned the history like I have. So I was just wondering what you think would be the best step or the best like first steps to take in trying to educate someone who's never really learned this history as much as maybe I have as a student.
I love that question. And I always encourage my students, annoy your parents as much as possible, right? And just as much as you can. And this is the best kind of annoyance. So I love your question because it gets at one of my earlier points, which is, I really think that this is a debate for your generation. And one of the reasons why I think that is because the kind of history that you learned and that you're learning right now, it's really difficult to frame just how different it is from what my parents, your parents, and especially grandparents learned about American history, right? You can take any number of issues that you covered this year, especially, within the narrative of race in America, given that that's sort of related to what we're talking about tonight, that would have been completely foreign, I think, to past generations. The story, for example, of Black Union soldiers fighting, roughly 200,000 fighting in the United States Army by 1865, those stories in large part only entered textbooks in the late 1970s, early 80s, mid 1980s. It is a brand new history. The history that you guys are learning right now is so much broader, gets us so far beyond that standard great white men of the United States history. And guess what? Guess what narrative our monument landscape reflects? It reflects great white men, right? And so that, I think, is one of the tensions that we're seeing play out right now in the streets. People, I think, are yearning for a wider representation. And so that doesn't get directly to your question, but I really do think, what you already laid out is the perfect place to start, which is share what you're learning with adults. Because the problem is, you know more. I'm not just sort of trying to get on your good side here. It's just true. The history that you're being taught is much deeper, much broader. It is much more sophisticated. I can't stand people who are, we got a problem in our schools. I don't want to minimize that. And we have a problem in this country with funding history education, right? That's certainly true. But where it's being done right, it's being done right in a way that is completely alien, I think, or would be completely alien to people who took US history just 25 years ago, right? And so I do think you have an obligation, and the rest of you have an obligation to share what you know, because that, I think, is the narrative that is going to drive the debate we're having right now, right? That's the narrative, right? And so, and I'll be honest, I mean, that is sort of what drives me every morning as a history teacher, because it's not just, we're not just trying to fill your heads with facts, with even a new interpretation. The question is like, what are you going to do with it, right? What is the usefulness of this narrative? How does it inform how you think about yourself in relationship to others around you and others, you know, around the country, right? What is it possible? And this is one of the big challenges right now. Is it possible in a narrative that seems so complex, that tries to be all things to all people, bring everyone in? Is it possible to sort of fashion a national identity around this new narrative? That's a question that academic historians are still struggling with. And I think one way forward is, can younger generations find ways to actually make that happen in society, right? It's not just an academic exercise, right? And I think one way in which we can perhaps see that sort of working out now is in the streets, especially in connection to these monuments. It's a great question. I hope I gave you something there. And one day I need to visit Korea.
Oh, well, you have someone to stay with. Ashley, Ashley, you can put him up, right? Yes. All right. Kevin, we got 3 more questions. I don't want to monopolize all your time. I know. No.
I could do this all night.
Excellent.
I'm serious.
and also want to say the same to everybody who's here with us. I want to thank you all for being here. Of course, if anybody needs to go, feel free. None of us will be offended. And we are, of course, recording this. So anything you missed at the end, we'll be sending out the recording, and you'll be able to catch that. This is a question I'm looking forward to hearing from Christian Sufal, and that's because I've heard, Kevin, I've actually heard you answer. I've heard your take on this question. So
okay, then you can answer it for.
Very excited to hear it from Christian. So go ahead, Christian.
Go for it.
Hi, my name's Christian. I am going into 10th grade, and I just wanted to, I want to know what you think about the idea of putting these Confederate memorials, like the idea of them, rather out in the open as monuments in museums, similar to how Germany has done with all of Nazism. Like there are no monuments dedicated to any Nazi figure in Germany.
Yeah, and a lot of that had to do with American occupation at the end of the war, and even Soviet occupation in East Berlin and East Germany. It's a great question, and I've, as someone who who has worked with museums, this is one of those really tough questions, and it's an especially difficult question right now, because as all of you know, with the pandemic, museums are they're either still closed, depending on where they're located, or I was just on the phone today with the American Civil War Museum in Richmond, which you may have visited along the James River. I've done a lot of work with them. They just opened their doors again this past week, just part-time. And a lot of museums, the problem is going to be moving forward that they're going to struggle just keeping their doors open. So then you have to ask, right, your question in that context, because are they going to be willing to spend the necessary funds to bring in some of these monuments, right? And then, of course, to contextualize them, in other words, to work them up into a proper exhibit. And I think the tougher question is going to be this: do museums want to be the new front line of this debate, right? So we tend to think that museums are neutral spaces, or at least that's actually wrong, because a lot of museums today, they actually declare themselves as non-neutral spaces. So I want to sort of pull back on that. But we at least do think that museums are places where we can go into and put our emotions a little bit to the side for the sake of education, right? And the question I think a lot of museums are going to have to focus on is, do they want to deal with the possible fallout of people not being able to do that? And actually, imagine bringing part of the Lee statue into the American Civil War Museum. Do they want to worry about their museum exhibits being vandalized in their halls, in their rooms, their exhibit rooms? Do they want to have to worry about people protesting outside? And that, I think, is a real possibility here, given the current state of things. Some places have done that. So the University of Texas at Austin took a statue of Jefferson Davis down in 2017 after Charlottesville, after the violence in Charlottesville. And they did a wonderful job of setting up an exhibit, contextual panels that explain the history. At the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, students actually took down a Confederate soldier statue 2 years ago named Silent Sam. This was an incredibly controversial statue that was dedicated in 1913, in large part because of the dedication speech delivered by a former Confederate veteran, a wealthy man by the name of Julian Carr. And in his dedication speech, this is in 1913, he brought his audience back to the spring of 1865, him just coming home from the war and having to walk down the streets of Chapel Hill and seeing a newly freed Black woman wearing an outfit that was not the outfit of an enslaved person, who was, in his mind, being a little bit, or sort of behaving outside of her racial category, if you will. She was behaving as a white woman, and he found it offensive. What did he do? He beat her. In fact, in his own words, in the dedication speech, he horsewhipped her. And he's telling this in 1913. So he's telling a story about horsewhipping a Negro woman in 1865 to make a point about the statue in 1913, at the height of Jim Crow, okay? That made this statue so controversial that the University of North Carolina could not, even though they wanted to create a brand new facility just for the statue, just to interpret it, a place where history classes could go to study the statue, all kinds of possibilities. The school had to abandon it. And the school had to abandon it because the students simply would not tolerate Silent Sam remaining on campus in any way, shape, or form. In fact, I was on campus a few months ago. Not only is there nothing left of the statue and the base, they completely redid the grounds so that if you never knew a statue was there, you would not know any better, right? I mean, it's completely, the landscape is completely shifted. So I do think, sorry, it's a long-winded answer. I do think some places will find a way to do that, what you're asking. And I think you'll find other places that, for any number of reasons, will resist giving a home to these statues. It's a great question.
Kevin, do
Thank
you
you
want
so much.
Oh, sorry. Kevin, I wonder, do you want to share as well? I know there was an anecdote you shared with us about your wife coming from Germany. And
yeah, I mean, my wife, I won't say too much about her, but being from Germany and not knowing much about the Civil War, she can do many of the tours that I lead now. But if she had her way, all of our monuments would be turned to dust. And she has no problem saying that, because for her, for her, it's equivalent to, having a statue to any high-ranking Nazi, or even high-ranking, German general from World War II. For her, it's an absurdity, right? And at the same time, of course, I'll just say this, that Germany has done an incredible job of memorializing the Holocaust, right? And there's much that I think the United States can learn from the steps that Germany has taken to find ways to remind Germans of World War II. One of the best examples, of course, are those sort of I think I'm pronouncing it right, stones, these little stones, square stones that they place in the streets or the walkways that you can almost trip on if you don't look out. And if you look down, it's the names that are in front of homes. They're the names of Jewish families that died during the Holocaust. And so you literally are reminded of it in your daily, your most basic activities, during the day. I don't know if that was the story, Jonathan, but yeah, I mean, she said a number of things about our monument landscape that I just will not share.
Aiden, you are up.
Hi, I'm Aiden. I'm a rising junior. Last year I was an APUSH, and I think I did my Civil War monument on actually a different monument. It wasn't technically a Confederate monument. It was a Eternal Light Peace Memorial. So that was sort of like a different take on it.
Gettysburg.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you said earlier that monuments represent who we take ourselves to be, and that it's for us to decide what we want to do in the future, taking steps forward with these. And you sort of posed us a question, so if you don't mind, I'm going to answer it with my completely personal opinion. Well, I think that, if a monument leads anyone to believe that, they're less than or they're not welcome in a space, I think even if there's one lady, if there's that African-American woman, even in a group of 10,000 people or 1 million people, even if she's the only one who finds that offensive, I think that is cause to take it down, because no one should have to be reminded of the terrible past of slavery, really. I will never understand, even if I try to empathize as much as I could. I will never understand what it's like to be a Black person in America, because, that past is really hard. And when you have to walk past a monument of a slave every single day, I don't think that, reminding you that your ancestors were beaten and enslaved for hundreds of years, that's definitely reason to take a monument down. I think that the whole thing, though, is oversimplified. People think that in taking down the monuments will solve the issue of, Black Americans not feeling welcome here. And I think that's mostly white people who think that. And I think that is an oversimplification of, the current situation at hand, that, Black Americans still won't feel welcome if we don't address issues of systemic racism, things like that. So yeah, that's sort of what I had to say. And I think that contextualizing monuments isn't a good way to go, just because the simple fact that we're having a monument commemorating slavery in any way, shape, or form, or a man who fought for slavery, can't stand. So then I had a question that was just about, you said who we take ourselves to be. And I sort of answered that. And then it's for us to decide. So if we have a monument in Georgia, is my voice and my opinion on whether that monument should stay up just as valid as, a citizen of Georgia who lives in front of that monument?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I can only answer it the way that I handle these situations when I go to places and work with schools, and especially with just communities that are struggling with some of these issues. And I get asked that question in a way, or a version of that question. And I want to say that my opinion isn't as valuable as one that is local. And the reason is because I think it's important to remember that memorials happen organically, locally. In other words, that they go up because people in local communities have a need or interest in putting them up in a public space. it fulfills something very local, right? It could be a tragedy that took place. Could be any number of things that serve as a catalyst for why people do these things. So that original sort of creation and dedication happens locally. And I think if the question arises as to whether or not it remains, I also think that has to happen locally. It has to happen among the people who are directly impacted by having to live in that close proximity or live in the community in which it's located. It doesn't mean, of course, that there aren't ways for you to voice your concern. Certainly there are, but whether or not just because you have a concern or you have an opinion, whether it's relevant, I think that's a different point altogether. I think that's a different issue altogether. So I tend to stay out of, not entirely, but I tend to, especially when I'm directly engaged with local communities, I tend to sort of stay out, just because it's not my role to begin with. I'm usually there to help people better understand the history. That's my skill set. My skill set is not to engage in politics with people, to try to convince them of a certain position. But if you're in your own community, you are engaged as a citizen of that, as a resident of that community. And I think that's where the rubber meets the road, as they say. That's where your voice matters, because your voice is supposed to be reflected in that monument or memorial. How's that?
Yeah, well said, as always.
The other thing I just want to add about your earlier point about places being people being made to feel welcome, that if it impacts one person negatively, that should be taken into account. I think one of the most influential moments for me in the last few years was listening to the mayor of New Orleans, Mitch Landrieu. I get a chance the end of July to interview him about this whole monument debate. Mitch Landrieu, the mayor of New Orleans, basically oversaw the removal of 4 key Confederate, one a Reconstruction monument or memorial, back in 2017. And as the Lee Monument, a huge 60-foot Lee Monument, was coming down, he addressed the city. And at one point in his speech, and you can YouTube it, I highly recommend Mitch Landrieu's Confederate Memorial speech. You'll find it. It's really worth listening to. At one point he says, what do you say to an African-American family who walk out of their home every day and have to answer their 5-year-old daughter as to why Robert E. Lee is looking down on them, right? And for me at the time, it just really drove home an important point that I always keep in mind, is that, we hope that first and foremost, our monuments and memorials do no harm. That's not asking much, right? Whether or not one person makes or breaks, we can have that discussion. But monuments should do no harm, right? And I think we have plenty of examples right now of monuments that have long done a great deal of harm. So I'll just sort of add that to it.
Ethan Sanders.
Hi, I'm Ethan Sanders.
Hey, Ethan.
I'm going to be a senior, and I just had, this discussion has covered a bunch of different people in history, including like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. And I was just wondering how, because of some opinions that have been raised about people, about those figures, and how should we address that in certain large memorials such as like Mount Rushmore. And that one is also particularly difficult because of the whole relationship with the Native American people who consider those sacred land and how it's still technically theirs, and also with the South Dakota governor saying that he's not going to allow it to be removed in any way, shape, or form, or be reconstructed. So I was just wondering, like, how should we handle these controversial figures in such a esteemed memorial such as Mount Rushmore?
Yeah, I think the first thing to remember, it's a good question, about places like Mount Rushmore is they're not going anywhere, right? And they're not going anywhere for a number of reasons. The most important reason is they're on federal property, right? And I think we all know that getting the federal government to do anything, forget about moving Mount Rushmore, doing whatever you can imagine to Mount Rushmore, like that's just not going to happen, right? So Mount Rushmore is going to be with us for the foreseeable future. Confederate monuments on, you were at Gettysburg, you walked, hopefully, part of Seminary Ridge, or what's called Confederate Avenue. That's federal property. Those monuments, which a lot of people have asked about, they're not going anywhere, right? And so, I think that kind of restriction, I think once you sort of accept that, and I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't, as a result of that, not push for a removal if you are really committed to seeing Mount Rushmore demolished or blown to smithereens, you have the right to do that. But I wonder whether or not, large, significant memorials on federal property, I mean, they do raise larger questions about, I think, our own communities. They raise larger questions about issues like reparations, right? Which has been a hot topic, whether or not reparations should be paid to the descendants of formerly enslaved people. So monuments, memorials can also serve as a catalyst for any number of discussions about any number of topics. Is it possible? I mean, the federal government, for example, recently declared, and this is the subject of my new book project, declared South Carolina an island or group of islands, most notably Port Royal. This is the place where Reconstruction started in the summer of 1863. Before 2017, there was no national park branch that was devoted specifically to telling the story of Reconstruction. And the only way that can happen is if the federal government passes a law that basically sets aside, a new place as a National Park Service site, just like Gettysburg or any other National Park Service site. So so by focusing on a monument, a large monument, it could point to absences on our national landscape, right, that need to be addressed. In other words, what I mean by that is it could point to, all right, we got sort of, how many white guys are on? Is it 4?
Yeah, 4. It's
okay.
Jefferson, Washington, Lincoln,
right.
and Roosevelt.
So, maybe we need a new Mount Rushmore or something. Maybe we need something of that scale that addresses, some other aspect of our past. But I'm just sort of throwing that out as one example, because I think in this case, it really isn't about removal. It's really more about what can we use these sites to shine a light on. So that's one way of going about it.
Thank you so much.
You got it. Absolutely.
And for us to, I mean, we could of course be going on for hours, but to kind of wrap up, you did write a book about the myth of Black Confederates that came out last year. And that in itself is, I wonder if you could just kind of share a little bit about that. Book is available on Amazon. Anybody can purchase it. It'll be at your house the next day. Great book. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how essentially that myth itself was developed as a memorial to a particular set of values and a particular interpretation of history.
I mean, there is this myth that you will find on hundreds, if not thousands, of websites. And this, of course, is a good lesson, a good reminder to always question the websites that you are using when you are writing your history papers, because, of course, the website is like the Wild West. Anyone can do anything on the internet. There's no control, no gatekeepers. And the last in recent years, a myth has been propagated, spread, that the Confederacy recruited anywhere between 5,000 and 100,000 black men, enslaved men, as soldiers in the Confederate Army, right? Now, you might say between 5 and 100,000, wow, that's a wide spread. It is indeed, and it gives you a sense of how absurd this is on its face. But it's a myth that serves a certain purpose, and it's a myth that is embraced by people who are not ready to give up on their idealized memory of the Confederacy, right? They want to believe that their great-great-grandfathers fought valiantly for the Confederacy that had nothing at all to do with protecting slavery and white supremacy. And so it's a wonderful example of the way myth often sort of rises to the level of history. And it's a great example of the way in which we often use history or turn history into myth in a way that sort of serves our own needs, our own agenda. So if you want to ignore the issue of slavery and white supremacy as it relates to the Confederacy, bring up the Black Confederate, because it gives you a way of saying, well, you had your 200,000 black men fight in the Union Army. They fought in segregated regiments between 1863 and 1865 for the United States. In the Confederacy, we had our own black men, and they fought from the first day until the very last day. And they fought in integrated regiments. And so what it does is it turns the Confederacy into an experiment in civil rights. It actually places the Confederacy further along the civil rights road than the United States, which sounds, of course, absurd, but it is. But I'll connect this to the monuments real fast, because we've been talking about monuments. The Confederate monuments, for the most part, they do mythologize the Confederacy, right? But they also, because what they do is they ignore the issue of slavery. They don't address the centrality of slavery and white supremacy. But they also mythologize the Black experience, right? They also turn African Americans into loyal slaves, loyal Confederate slaves. And so if you visit Arlington National Cemetery, and I should have shown you this as an example tonight, but if you go to Arlington National Cemetery, just across the Potomac from DC, you will see the largest monument in the entire cemetery is a Confederate memorial. Dedicated in 1914, Woodrow Wilson, the president, was there. And if you look around, so around the monument are 365 Confederate dead, buried in one of the most prominent parts of the cemetery. There are Black Union soldiers buried at Arlington, but no one sees them because they're buried in section 27 of Arlington, which is in a far corner of the cemetery. No one goes there. But the Confederate section, you can't miss it. And along, there you go. So if you look, and I don't know if you can see it from this angle, but as you, this frieze, this relief around the base, if you were to walk around it, you would see the image of what's called the loyal mammy, the loyal Black woman who took care of the enslaved, of the white man, the master's children. And in this part of the relief, the Confederate officer is handing off his child to this loyal slave, this loyal mammy figure, so he can fight in the war, but doesn't have to worry about his children because the loyal slaves will always be there taking care and defending the family. So that's one example. And on the other side, if you continue to walk around, you can actually begin to see it. To the left, you see these Confederate soldiers marching. You'll also see what appears to be a Black man wearing a Confederate uniform marching side by side. And that's what it is. It's a Black man in a uniform, but it's not a soldier. It's actually what would have been called a body servant, right? In other words, a master, a Confederate soldier who brought a slave with him into the Confederate Army. And so to assist him. So it's not a soldier, but an enslaved man. But this memorial essentially is essentially serving not just to erase the issue of slavery, but to recast it, to mythologize the place of African Americans in the Confederacy itself. And it's one of the most disturbing monuments that I've ever seen. And I bring teachers there every summer. And I never, I never get used to seeing it. It's so powerful. Yeah, there's the shot of the mammy figure about to take the child. And ask yourself, think about the Lincoln statue that we looked at earlier, right? And the way in which this dehumanizes African Americans, the way it casts them not as full citizens. These are people who obviously did not want their freedom. They wanted to remain loyal to the Confederacy and loyal to their masters. Think about how dehumanizing that is. In 1914, at the height of the Jim Crow era, it justifies legal segregation in the eyes of most white Southerners, most white Americans. And this is not in the Deep South. This is in Arlington National Cemetery. So I'll leave it at that. I mean, what a way to end.
Well, Kevin, thank you so much. This is amazing. I mean, we knew it would be, to be honest.
Appreciate
that. Yeah. So, and I'll tell you all who are here with us is that if you, I mean, there's so many fascinating resources to explore on this topic, and generally every one of those resources you explore, you end up seeing a quote from Kevin. So you kind of have like the dude right here. So thank you so much. It was this was really great. Thank you to everybody who joined us. And Kevin, one of these days when things are normal, we are bringing you to San Diego because you have never been.
I've never been to California. I really want to visit. So absolutely.
Fantastic. I think you've got a whole group of new fans now. So it will be done for sure.
I appreciate it. You guys stay safe, everyone. I had a blast, and thanks so much.